Dear Peter, it's a pleasure to see you. How are you doing there?
I'm very well. It's a huge honor to be with you and to be helping an institution which I think is incredibly important.
Thank you so much for your consent to participate in this important event. You have a very remarkable biography. You've been born in Kyiv. Your father comes from Chernivtsi. You spent most of your life in Great Britain. Then you've been in Moscow, I believe, for 8 or 10 years, for a long, very long time. And probably you are one of the best connoisseurs of the Putin regime. As far as I know, your definition of Putin, I believe, is brilliant. But I would suggest everybody to read this book because this is a very important book. If you know about the Russia, read the Pieter Pomerancev book, the first book. But my question is this: I don't really remember whether I get to know you first before I read your text, but there is one text which I like particularly very much. It's very impressive and very moving. And this is text that has been published, I believe, in the London Review of Books few months after Euromaidan. And this text, you confess that after visiting Ukraine and meeting people from Maidan, you started to feel yourself Ukrainian. So my question is, how does it feel being Ukrainian now, after all these 5 years?
So listen, I mean, look, I think that anybody who cares about democracy in Europe and in the world should really feel themselves Ukrainian, just like Kennedy once said in bad German, Ich bin ein Berliner. I think everybody who cares about democracy has to feel Ukrainian these days. And if they don't, it's up to us to explain to them why they should. But for me, look, I was talking about a very concrete political context where at numerous conferences, I'd always be asked, you know, how do you want to be introduced? British, Russian, Soviet born, whatever. And I was like, you know, once the war started, it became a political position. You know, you have to sort of say, I am Ukrainian. So it's not about feelings, it's about principles and values, really. So I think that's really the main thing. And that's if anything been strengthened. But as you know from my writing, you know, I like to explore different identities. I'm very lucky. I've managed to be British and Ukrainian and German and many other things. So I feel myself very blessed. And it's so exciting exploring Ukrainian identity, partly because it's an identity that's in development, and having any sort of role in this adventure is a huge privilege.
Thank you. And I can help but asking you, and how does Ukraine looks for you now? Do you feel any kind of Ukrainian fatigue, as many foreigners do? Or if yes, are you frustrated with the Ukrainian developments? If not, what would you say to someone who is frustrated?
Quite the opposite. Part of what I've learned from my Ukrainian heritage, and even more so from the Ukrainians that I meet and work with, is a kind of, you know, maybe one could call it a doomed optimism, you know, which sees things in a historical context. And so when my friends from Britain are having crises over COVID or over Brexit, I always switch on my inner Ukrainian and go, well, it's not the Gulag, you know, things aren't too bad. You know, historically, this isn't as bad as it could be. And I actually find that's a wonderful source of resilience. And I find the resilience that Ukrainians have to really see things in a longer perspective, not in a perspective of 1, 2, 3, or 4 or 5 years, is quite inspiring. And there's a sort of, you know, a shrug that a lot of Ukrainians have, which deals with these huge problems and sees them in context, which I find very inspiring. I think we all need to switch in our inner Ukrainian. And look, like I've kind of learned from my Ukrainian friends not to maybe focus on, you know, the institutions of the state, and certainly not to put all my faith in them, however much I think they need to be reformed or built. You know, when I look at Ukraine, I look at the incredible growth in civil society. I look at the World Values Survey and see how values are changing in a really very stable way over time. I see this incredible resilience. And I see what I find now most exciting, this incredible flourishing of culture, of films. There's a fantastic film festival on in London by the Ukrainian Institute, theatre, novels. I'm constantly telling my European and American friends that I think the most exciting literature in Europe is happening in Ukraine at the moment. Just look at the books that have come out this year. They are stunning. And that really shows, you know, this incredible society being formed. When it comes to the states and the reforms of the states, you know, I'm happy to see a lot of УКУ graduates in positions of responsibility. But look, this is going to be a long journey. You know, this is going to be a long journey. Let's look at it historically. 30 years of an independent Ukraine is already a miracle. So, you know, I try not to have false hopes, which I know are going to get frustrated.
Thank you. I have to confess, I haven't a chance to read your book yet, your new book, but I'm looking forward to reading it. I know that has been translated into Ukrainian, it must be appear already, has been published already. But this is an event, it's an event it's a near future. But I know your another work, which is your project that you initiated with the Applebaum, with the framework called London School of Economics. And it deals with Ukraine particularly, with the discourse, historical discourses. And you basically deals with the issue of propaganda. And you define in this project Ukraine as a country that stands on the front line of nowadays global crisis. And you say basically that it's reflected among other facts, among other that Ukraine has been a constant target of propaganda, propaganda campaign promoted by the Kremlin, by Putin. So my question is, judging by your experience from this project, in your opinion, what is the most effective strategy for countering the Kremlin distortions?
So quite right, Yaroslav. So I, together with Anne Applebaum, my colleague, we run a research initiative that has been based at the London School of Economics, a university in London, and is now moving to Johns Hopkins University in Washington, which is, you know, put it very simply, we both got a little bit tired of just analyzing propaganda. You know, we spent many years, maybe 5 years, analyzing it. And we're like, okay, what are we going to do about it? And very specifically, what is the role of journalists in this world? And even more specifically than that, how can journalists learn to reach audiences that live in an alternative reality? This sort of polarization is happening everywhere. We see it in America, where a huge amount of the population live with an alternative set of facts. We see it in Germany, where 15% of the population live in what German critics called an alternative universum. And of course, in Ukraine, we have seen a large amount of the population under the deep influence of Russian and of course, proxy Russian propaganda, where they live in a separate reality. This is obviously very dangerous for any democracy. For a country at war, it's devastating. So what we're very interested in is, what is the role of journalism to create social cohesion, social resilience, to bring people together in a common public sphere? You know, what is this democratic public sphere, which is kind of the root of democracy, where people are talking to each other, listening to each other, disagreeing with each other, but in communication with each other, and seeing themselves as part of a common future. So that's what we investigate. We do many experiments in many countries, working with journalists to understand how can journalists reach vulnerable audiences. And in Ukraine, we basically what we do is we combine sociology, computer analytics, and journalism. So we start off doing a lot of sociology, trying to understand what divides people, because propaganda these days is all about dividing people, finding wedge issues that split your adversary. Finding what divide people, but finding what also unites them. So we do a lot of sociology, a lot of polling, a lot of segmentation analysis. And in Ukraine, you know, to cut a very long story short, it was a 2-year project. We essentially found that there are large parts of society who might be divided by some Kremlin propaganda narratives, often about the Second World War, but also about issues such as decommunization. But even though they're divided by these narratives, when you look at their values and their hopes for Ukraine's future, they're actually very united. They have a lot of similarities. So our question was, when we worked with journalists, how can we try to engage people around these ideas for a common future and also common traumas in the past. Because while there are experiences that divide, there are so many that unite. And maybe we need to think about exploring these things, exploring these common traumas. In our analysis, a lot of these were around the late Soviet period. The war in Afghanistan was something that people felt a lot of wholeness around, the traumas of seeing relatives killed in Afghanistan, Chernobyl, various injustices of the late Soviet system. These were all things that brought people together. Even people who said they were nostalgic for the Soviet Union. When you ask them concretely, do you want the censorship of the Soviet Union today? Do you want soldiers to have no rights like they had during the war in Afghanistan? Do you want the ecological disasters of the Soviet Union today? And even people who are nostalgic for the USSR, more in the east of the country, said, no, of course we don't want that. We don't want that in the Ukraine of the future. So, you know, beneath these identity wars, these memory wars, is actually this whole reservoir of common traumas and common values that can be explored.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And that was a very easy question. We were talking about the history. What about the future? Say, there are many things that Ukraine is very much different from Great Britain and vice versa. Great Britain is very different from Ukraine, but there's at least one thing in common. We have a very strong populism in both countries. You have a Boris Johnson, we have a Zelensky, which in some ways could be similar. So my question is, how do you see the future of Ukraine, say in next 10 years? How do you see the future of Great Britain? And would they ever come together within the European Union? That's a very easy question. I know, we know the answer.
Well, actually, both Britain and Ukraine are going to be two countries for the medium term on the edge of the European Union with very intense relationships with it. And I could see a lot of commonalities being built there. So I think we're partners now. We're very similar in our kind of relationship with Europe. So I think you know, that could be quite fruitful. But look, populism is happening everywhere. Look, so many of the issues in Ukraine are actually typical issues that we see everywhere. It's just intensified in Ukraine because you have a war. So these problems become existential because an adversary will take advantage of them. But populism we see everywhere, and we have to think about what are the root causes of it. Because I focus on the information space, what I see this sort of social media driven populism as doing is sort of feeding on people's sense of they're not being able to change things. Take back control was the slogan of Brexit, for example. And we have this very strange condition with social media. People can talk a lot, they can get very angry, but they can't actually change very much. So one of the big solutions with populism and technology going forward was going to be thinking about how technology can help get people involved in politics. How can it help people participate in politics at the local level, at the medium level, at the high level as well? People need more than just a vote every 4 years. You know? So all populists are always saying is like, you feel dissatisfied, let me be the vehicle of satisfaction. And it's always a false promise. But I do think technology and internet technology can help with that process. I mean, that's the great kind of battle that we're in. We need to find new ways. And there's lots of experiments in the world. And I think Ukraine can be a very important space for that, partly because some of the best experiments will come on the level of regional self-governance, regional administrations. And, you know, I think that's a direction Ukraine is heading in. Plus, Ukraine has this amazing IT sector. So increasing people's sense that they are empowered through technology is very important. Now, of course, Zelensky talks about this, but his ideas sound pretty vague and pretty terrible. But he gets it in a way. He gets that people need
understand it.
Power. Now, this could be awful. If it's like voting on Facebook for every law, this is going to be terrible. But, you know, that is where the battle is. Empowerment and populism. That's the two tensions. And that's the same in Britain and Ukraine, but many European countries.
Thank you. And here's my final question, talking about the changes. Where do you see the role of the Ukrainian Catholic University?
Yeah, no, I think about this a lot because I've spoken at УКУ many times. And whenever I try to explain УКУ to my English friends, they get very confused. You mean a Catholic university? What does this mean? And I thought it was very clear from the wonderful students that were speaking earlier that УКУ fulfills this unique role, firstly, to set standards and excellent education and a non-corrupt education to show that, you know, the education system doesn't have to be corrupted. That's very important to set an example. But also, what I find so exciting about it is that it brings together both a traditional and conservative set of values, which are embedded in the church, but also what I would consider very progressive and liberal and forward-thinking ideas about politics. Now, in a lot of places, yeah, in Europe, in America, we see this, I think, very tragic fallout between liberal values and conservative values. I think between also cosmopolitan values and between patriotic values. I think УКУ shows you can have all of these together, that they can reinforce each other. You can have deeply conservative traditions in the best sense of that word and values, while still thinking in very, 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 really global cosmopolitan ways about the future of democracy, a European future, with very, very kind of smart ideas. Look at the students who are now in Ukrainian politics that came from the УКУ. They tend to be very, very, you know, very, 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 I don't know, shall we say European in their thinking. So I think that's remarkable. Patriotism and cosmopolitanism, liberalism and conservatism don't have to be in conflict. They can actually be part of a very, very powerful set of democratic values. And I think УКУ is a living kind of example of that. We could do a lot more of that. We could do with a lot more of that in many Western countries. Thank you so much. I believe it's a very positive message. So I would like to thank you, first of all, and then using opportunity that my rector is watching us, I would like to extend invitation for you to come to university and to teach for a term or two. Thank you again. My honor, my pleasure. Yeah.